We have been studying the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 and seeing the depths of this very fascinating sermon that Jesus has given to us. He's accomplishing a lot of things in here. I don't know if I could ever pack so much into one sermon as he does here. And certainly not as artfully as Jesus does, as the master teacher. We're kind of in a sub-series right now, or a series within our big Sermon on the Mount series, as we're looking at the heart of the law. There's a whole section from chapter 5, verse 17, all the way through verse 48, the end of that chapter, as Jesus goes through the 6 antitheses, the 6 times that he says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And he's doing some interesting things with their understanding of the law of Moses. He picks some times that they are misapplying and distorting the law in some way. And it varies slightly from command to command exactly how they're doing that. But Jesus feels the need to clarify to them that he is not an enemy of the law. He's not a rebel against it. He's not encouraging anyone to be a rebel against it. He's here to fulfill the law. But they don't even really know what the law is by this point. They are so distorted and so messed up that they're too busy finding strange loopholes and strange distortions to even really get the principles behind the law. And so we've been looking through those. The first example of that was murder. You shall not murder. Pretty basic, pretty easy. The Jews understood that. I think most people understand that, even who don't serve God. But Jesus took it farther than that. He said, why don't you murder? There's inherent value in God's creation and the life that he made. And so if that value is there, should I stop simply at not murdering you? Or should I also be careful not to insult and dehumanize? Should I be careful to resolve disputes that come up before they grow bigger? Should I maintain good relationships with my brethren? Lots of important things out of what seems to be a simple command to not murder. Last week we looked at 3 more of those with adultery, divorce, and swearing oaths. Once again, the Jews are distorting those commands. And the underlying principles at play are even more important than the particular laws themselves, though those particular laws are important. So the command against adultery is about more than adultery. It also targets lust. It also tells us to be faithful in every way to your spouse. The command against divorce is that marriage is a lifelong commitment. So rather than simply saying, don't divorce, it's maintain a marriage, commit to a marriage for life, understanding what God wants it to be. And then the whole command with the swearing of oaths, they had distorted that in many strange ways as they were busy looking for loopholes more than anything else in the kinds of oaths that were binding and other oaths that were not, based upon technicalities. And Jesus says, forget all of that. An oath isn't what determines truth. You can use an oath to bring gravity to a situation or recognize the gravity of a situation, but truth ought to be a given. Be transparently honest in all things. So we've got 2 more of these antitheses. We'll look at those today and in the little Heart of the Law sub-series. The first of those is an eye for an eye. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, Matthew 5, verses 38 through 42, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. This phrase, an eye for an eye, is commonly known today. We sometimes quote it in different circumstances, even aside from biblical talk. And it's actually a principle that's found outside the Bible in general too, even in history, even in old laws. It is a direct quote from multiple places in the Mosaic Covenant. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you want to turn to Deuteronomy 19. Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 through 21. It says, "If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to a dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot." It is a serious matter to accuse someone of evil or any kind of wrongdoing in any setting. If I just walk up to you today and say, "Hey, you stole from me, you broke into my house," and you're going to be kind of offended, especially if you didn't do that. That's a serious matter to accuse a person. And in the setting here where it's a court setting, a trial, it's even more serious. I'm accusing you of something that could get you punished, that could get a punishment handed down to you by these judges. And if that's true, you might have to pay a fine, you might have to be imprisoned, whatever the offense is, the punishment can be different. But if my accusation is false, if I am maliciously targeting you, because maybe we have some other dispute, then you might have to wrongly pay that fine or wrongly endure some punishment simply because I am showing malice toward you. If I lie and accuse you of a crime that would get you imprisoned or fined or put to death, how is that really any different than me kidnapping you or stealing from you or killing you? We say, well, it's not my hands that are doing it, but if you go to jail because of my false accusation, it is like I have kidnapped you. If you pay a fine because of my false accusation, it is like I have stolen from your wallet. And if you are put to death because of my false accusation, it is like I have killed you myself. This is serious. We understand that. Nobody wants to be falsely accused of anything. If that's ever happened to you before in any setting, you know how much it hurts and how offensive it is. In the Mosaic Covenant, when a false witness was identified there in a court of law, the punishment was that the same punishment that would have applied to the person they were accusing gets reflected back onto the false accuser. An eye for an eye, hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, so on and so forth. And that was meant to deter people from making these false accusations. If I'm so angry against you that I might want to make a false accusation, hopefully this fear and this thought that I might have to endure the same punishment myself if I am found out, that's going to stop me from doing that. And then we can refer to the earlier point in the first antithesis that there's a different way for us to handle those disputes. Well, another example, kind of different, is Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25. Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25. "When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." Here we have a situation where men are fighting, and it results in the injury of a pregnant woman who is apparently just an innocent bystander in this. Sometimes fights do bubble up like that and end up affecting the people around them. And she has been injured, and the trauma of this makes it where she gives birth prematurely. Now that is an assault. That is offensive and a crime and worthy of, in this case, said a fine, even if no lasting harm is done. The baby is born fine. There's no lasting injury to either mother or child. The judges still get to determine a fine for what that man has done. What if there is lasting harm? If there is lasting harm, then the punishment increases to match the harm that was done. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a wound for a wound. Now you'll note that the action was the same regardless. It was the same fight. It was the same accidental or negligent kind of assault against this woman. But because the harm increased, the punishment increased. When we look at Jewish history, we see that they usually didn't follow this completely literally. Punishments for criminals were usually not the exact reflection of the harm that they committed. Instead, this was used as a guiding principle for determining appropriate punishments. Now, I don't want you to get too hung up on the two examples that I picked. I picked those two because they actually use the exact wording of an eye for an eye. But there are a lot of others throughout the law that use the same principle, if not the exact same words, where the more harm is done, the more punishment there is in return. So when judging appropriate restitution or punishment, we can look at two sides of it. We can look at what the intent was, what neglect took place, or whether it was simply an accident. That's one part, what you meant to do, what you were trying to do. And then the other part is the harm that actually occurred. And both of those can increase the punishment. And that phrase, an eye for an eye, is really dealing with this side over here, that as the harm increases, so too does the punishment. History shows us that this gave the Jewish people the concept of scaling punishments. If I accidentally kill your ox, I owe you an ox, or enough money to go buy one, right? That is something that makes sense. But in matters of injury, it was usually proportionate fines as restitution. We don't really know of too many cases where somebody actually got their eye gouged out because they gouged out another person's eye. That was used to determine how much of a fine there would be or what the punishment should scale up to. Well, this principle of lex talionis, that's the kind of technical name for it, is in response to the basic temptation of personal vengeance. The standard that a selfish person lives by and a violent person lives by is, if you harm me, I will strike back twice as hard. And we know people who live that way, who are not about proportionate response, but who want to send a message. And so if we apply that kind of philosophy to the Jews, then it would have been, if you kill my ox, I'll burn your fields. Let's apply it to today. You scratch my car, I shoot you dead. We recognize there's something wrong here. That's not right. And when we apply that standard, it just escalates the violence until everybody has been harmed. That's how you end up with the situations like the gang wars you hear about, right? It just keeps getting worse and worse as they bounce back and forth in punishing the other. The problem with this idea is that it is both personal and disproportionate. The law addresses both sides of that. Vengeance is not supposed to be personal. In the case where there's a false witness, right, it's the judges who are to listen to the witnesses and to determine, is this the truth of the matter? And if the witness is false, the judges are the ones who hand down that punishment against him. In the case of the pregnant woman who is injured, again, she doesn't go chase that man down. Her husband doesn't go chase that man down. Again, it goes to a court. It goes to a judge. It goes to some sort of legal system to determine what was the intent, what was the harm done, and what is the proper punishment and or restitution that needs to take place for justice to win the day. When we bring it into a personal setting, well, now it's vengeance and not justice. The other side was that the punishment should fit the crime, that it shouldn't be disproportionate. And some societies have tried this, have tried making intense punishments for even small offenses to encourage people to do the right thing. That if you jaywalk, you're going to have years in prison, or a terrible fine, or a terrible beating. Well, that's not really proportionate. And so we understand that rather than unchecked vengeance, an unchecked personal retribution, instead we see that a judge or jury or whatever legal system ought to determine an appropriate and proportionate response. These laws are given to restore what was taken from the victim of a crime. Whether that's intentional or negligent or accidental, still there are ways that we harm each other. And so justice is meant to make that person whole again. We understand that, and we appreciate it when we have been harmed, and we. So what were the Jews of Jesus' day saying? They had turned this principle of justice, of trying to make it less personal and more proportionate, and they had turned it back into an excuse for vengeance. If a judge can hand down a punishment of an eye for an eye, well, I can just cut out the middleman. And I can get justice for myself. After all, you wronged me, so I get to wrong you back. The Bible says so. Except it doesn't. That was never the point. Jesus doesn't want them to be people of vengeance, and they should not be using that legal standard as an excuse to seek vengeance of their own. That is exactly the reason why that I cannot come up to you after worship today, pull out a pair of handcuffs, cuff your arms behind your back, throw you in the back seat of my car, take you to a room and lock you in it and leave you there. But the police could. And if you were found guilty of a crime, then you could be forced to stay in that prison cell. What would be kidnapping and assault on my part is justice on the part of a legal system and a law enforcement officer. There is a difference. Well, Jesus gives 3 uncomfortable examples of how far we should go to not take vengeance. He says, first, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. This is a personal injustice. If you have harmed me, if you have committed some offense against me, my response should be that I'm more willing to let you do it again than I am to seek vengeance of my own accord. It's kind of uncomfortable. I'd rather you not do that to me again. But Jesus says, turn the other cheek. If anyone would sue to take your tunic, be willing to let him have your cloak as well. That I see as a judicial injustice. Somebody is suing you and the wrong outcome has been reached. Your tunic has been taken, and at least in your eyes, that's not right. It shouldn't be. Well, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to go steal my tunic back from you? Am I going to resist the order? Jesus says, I would be more willing to let you have my cloak as well than to resist that injustice that has been done. Then thirdly, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. This is what the Roman soldiers would do. They would kind of show up, they'd see some Jewish person there, and they'd say, here, carry this load for me 1 mile. And they could compel a man to do that. And that is an example of governmental injustice. That's not right. That's not proper. An agent of the government is abusing his power. But what am I going to do about it if that happens to me? I'm not going to mount an insurrection against the government. Instead, I'll be willing to take the injustice and even go beyond. Now, those are all deeply challenging and make us feel uncomfortable. If you're anything like me, as you're reading those three things, you go, but hold on. And part of the reason for that is the Bible gives some other statements that are hard to reconcile with this. You know, the Bible shows a concept of self-defense. The Bible shows examples of utilizing the legal system, even making an appeal. You know, Paul doesn't accept the first judgment that is reached, and he appeals to Caesar. There's examples of righteous people calling on governmental leaders and their agents to act righteously, not simply sitting back and saying, well, they're going to do evil. They call them to do the right thing. So we try to put all these things together and understand, what is Jesus talking about? I don't want to rob the power from what Jesus is saying. I also don't want to oversimplify it. The best way that I can reconcile all of this is that Jesus is giving those at the end of the day kind of statements. At the end of the day, what are you going to do about it? So I might be able to defend myself and prevent you from harming me to save my own life. But if you have harmed me in some way and now the occasion is past, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to hunt you down and take vengeance? I might defend my family against a person who is trying to harm them. But if they have been harmed, and now we've moved on, what do I do? Spend the rest of my days trying to find that person and make their life miserable, to execute them in the street? The injustice has happened, but really we need to move on. There's a whole legal system. There's a whole way for us to resolve disputes. Again, remember, we're supposed to use the legal system instead of taking personal justice, personal vengeance. But what if a judicial injustice happens? That's sort of an interesting phrase, isn't it? A judicial injustice. You would hope that those two wouldn't go together. But they do, don't they? Because sometimes the courts don't get it right. Sometimes the jury makes a baffling decision. Sometimes the judge acts in a way that is not right. Sometimes justice does not win. And you know, we have whole mechanisms we can follow. We can appeal. We can try to get a case thrown out. We can do these different things. But at the end of the day, if justice does not win, what are you going to do about it? At the end of the day, if injustice has occurred and there are no more avenues, do you go and riot in the streets? Or do you acknowledge that sometimes justice doesn't win? The government doesn't always do what they're supposed to do. There's an understatement. The government makes decisions that we don't like. The government works great evil. There is probably more evil than good that happens at the hands of governmental leaders at different times from different people. That's not really a political statement, but it's just a realistic one. There's a lot of evil in government, and that happens when you have people in power who do not respect God. If the government does evil and violates the Constitution, or let's ratchet this up a whole bunch and forget about the Constitution, violates God's law, what are we going to do about it? Well, we actually have some things we can do about it, right? We have some mechanisms to try to influence our government. We, especially in ours, right? We can vote. We can, try to make our leaders hear us. We have some representational form of government, and so we can try to make our voices heard and probably do a little bit better than they could in the Roman Empire when Caesar doesn't care. So maybe there is something we can do. But what if it doesn't work? What if the government does evil and they won't listen, and we try to vote in somebody else and that person does evil too, and well, they're all evil? What if that happens? At the end of the day, what do? Do I join up with a rebel force to destabilize the government, to work a coup. No. I recognize that injustice happens. I might have some limited things I can do in each of these areas, personal, judicial, governmental, but my options as an individual run out quickly. What this comes down to is that God will judge. We can and should rightly cry out at the injustices, and I don't want us to be callous to them. I don't want us to simply resign ourselves into saying, well, the world is unjust, so quit crying about it. Injustice is evil, and it's good for us to recognize that, to identify it, and to empathize with those who are wronged by the various injustices that happen. But if we expect to spend our time chasing down every person and institution that have wronged us or wronged someone else, we are bringing this back into a personal domain that does not belong to us. It belongs to God. When I embody these situations personally, I create sinful situations. Think of the person who relies a little bit too much on this idea of defending oneself and is eager and excited for an opportunity to get to use their weapon against another person. That's scary. Who's spoiling for a fight, looking for an opportunity to be violent. That should never happen. Think of the rioters taking to the streets, burning homes and businesses when a court case goes wrong. You know, some of those court cases really did go wrong. Some of those really were unjust. But when was the solution ever to be burning homes and businesses and to riot in the streets? Think of the people who are stockpiling weapons and ammunition, training for the inevitable day that the government will go one injustice too far and we're just going to have a civil war. I come from the South. I've heard that quite a bit. Get your bunker ready. Get your weapons ready. Get your stockpile ready, because one day we're going to have to fight against the government. You know what? No. One day we're not. And I don't say that out of some pie in the sky idea that one day the government's going to be beautiful and happy and righteous and everyone's going to love God and there's going to be no more evil. I don't expect for that to happen. I expect for things to get worse. I hope that that's not what happens, but I expect that it will. Yet I see that it's not my place to bring the government to justice. It's God's. I have faith in a God who hears the blood of the innocent cry out from the ground and will right all wrongs. And so the heart of the law of vengeance is to give vengeance over to God. Not wrong. Apparently I can't type. Give vengeance over to God and His agents and live sacrificially even when wronged. See, that's where... Don't forget it, though, even if you're going to laugh at my typo. Don't forget that the heart is give vengeance over to God. Okay, the second one. Matthew 5, 43 through 48. About love and hate. Matthew 5, 43 through 48. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. By this point, we probably all understand that loving your neighbor is one of the two foundational commands of the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We recently studied the parable of the Good Samaritan. We get it. It's not a hard concept to understand. It's just a hard one to live. Where does the other half of this statement come from? Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Where does the and hate your enemy come from? there is not a verse in the law that tells them to hate their enemies. That's not something that exists, but there is kind of a related idea. Psalm 139, verses 21 and 22 gives us a similar kind of concept. Psalm 139, 21 and 22. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. David here says, I hate your enemies, God. Your enemies are my enemies. I loathe them, and because they are your enemies, they are my enemies. And that is a similar idea, but there is an important difference here. David is acknowledging that he hates what God hates. God's enemies are his enemies. But this is really more about his association with God than it is the way he treats these other people. The common rabbinic teaching was to love the fellow Jew and to hate the outsider. And that's not exactly what David is saying, and it's certainly not what God ever told them to do. There's a subtle distinction that makes a very large difference. In fact, Exodus 23, verses 4 and 5, commands the people to show compassion toward their enemies. Exodus 23, 4 and 5 says, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. Our selfish way that we would respond when our enemy is in trouble, when the ox of my enemy is lost, and I see that, I laugh and I say, he lost his ox. That's just great. I love to see him suffer. I love to see him lose something. That's not the way God wanted his people to act. He says, if you see your enemy's ox going astray, you go and you bring it back to him. If you see his donkey struggling under a load, you rescue it with him. Even if he wouldn't do the same thing for you, you ought to do that for them. So David may have said that he hates those who rise up against God, but maybe a more interesting question for us is, how does God treat his enemies? God has enemies. God has people who rise up against him, who rebel against him, who don't want to do what is right, and who commit great evil. How does God treat them? To be sons of your Father in heaven, Jesus says, act like your Father in heaven. We know that God eventually judges the rebellious and the wicked, but he shows an astounding level of mercy even toward his enemies. The sun and the rain bless the evil and the good alike. Evil people the world over experience all sorts of blessings from God. I'm gonna give you a very dangerous little sentence opener here. It's always dangerous when you start a sentence this way. If I were God, then the evil people, well, they wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't have a nice house to live in. They wouldn't have a nice car to drive. They wouldn't have food on their table. They wouldn't have air to breathe because they're wicked. Why should I give them anything? Well, you know, God's a little bit more merciful than I am. That's a really good thing because we've all benefited from that. God's a lot more merciful than we are. He blesses even the wicked. We've all benefited from that. The greatest example, obviously, is the sacrifice of Jesus, but I want you to notice and appreciate that even though God promises to bless his children and bless his people, he chooses to do far more than that. He chooses to give many blessings even to the wicked. The hope there is that his love will sway us to love him in return. It's the reason why he blessed Israel in so many ways and then eventually told them, look, I'm making a covenant with you. You need to obey me if you want the blessings to continue. But God made the first move to give them many good things. He does the same with us. We have benefited in so many ways from God's love and mercy and compassion, even when we did not deserve it. And that should help us to love God and to want to turn toward Him. Even the tax collector and the Gentile, Jesus says, naturally love those who love them in return. I'd say it takes a pretty sick person not to at least be able to follow the standard of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. How many people are there out there really who just wake up each morning saying, I want to cause some chaos and hurt everybody around me? Everybody. There are some wicked and evil people out there, but usually even evil people know to take care of their own. Know to take care of the people in their circle, their family, their associates, their friends. Jesus says, even the tax collectors know that. Even the pagans know that. God acts on a higher level, and He calls us to do the same. So the heart of the law of love and hate is to live as people of love and compassion toward all. To be less concerned about whether a person deserves it, and to err on the side of love. That doesn't mean that we ignore sin. It doesn't mean that we don't present people with the truth of the gospel. That is the most loving thing that you can do. I mean in everything else. Be compassionate. Be loving. Be generous. Give to the one who asks. Give generously. Do whatever you can. And if somebody doesn't deserve it, and you kick yourself, I've done that before. I've given something to someone who later proved that they did not deserve it. And I kicked myself for it because I felt like a fool. But really, in that situation, I should just say, I acted like God there. I acted like my Father did. In that I gave something to someone who did not deserve it, just like God gave things to me that I did not deserve. It's not my problem whether he deserves it or not. It's my problem to know how I will act to live as a person of love. The command to love your neighbor as yourself, that second fundamental command of the law, is not meant to be an excuse to narrowly define neighbor. Right? We already talked about that with the parable of the Good Samaritan. When that's your first reaction of who is actually my neighbor, who do I actually have to love, well, you've missed the point. Love like God does. Love freely. We've now reached the end of the 6 antitheses, where Jesus says, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. In all of these, Jesus has exposed the heart of the law to them, that they might understand what God wants to rule in their hearts. And along the way, he's given kingdom teaching as well. The things that Jesus has chosen to speak about there are principles that they should have known better and principles that we should know now and that we should be following now. We would do well to understand this and to obey these within. So that's the end of our sub-series. Next week, Lord willing, we will continue on with the Sermon on the Mount, going into chapter 6, into some new thoughts and ideas. But think about these things and think about this concept of not just looking at the most shallow reading of a law, but asking, why does God want us to do these things? And what are all the ways that I can obey God in principle and not just in word? If you need anything, you're ready to respond to God's invitation call to become His child, you can become one. We'd love to baptize you for the remission of your sins, if that is your desire. Or if you have any other need, then please come forward and let us know as together we stand and sing.